My name is Natalie M, formerly Natalie Grant, and I'm 32 years old. I'm the Director of Investment Strategy at ArborVest Capital, a fintech company based in Chicago. For the past 10 years, I've deliberately chosen not to work in Boston, not to follow my father into real estate, and never to get involved in any project the Grant family designated. I thought I was used to not being seen by my father. As a student, I was still asked, why not an A? As a teenager, I earned a full scholarship but was considered a traitor for not choosing the college he wanted. Later, every time I got a promotion, he'd call it luck or being favored because you're a woman. I grew accustomed to being undervalued, but I never stopped hoping. It took me over a year to write a gift I believed would change everything. A memoir titled Legacy. What my father taught me about grit. I personally designed the hardcover, chose the best paper, and printed a limited run. Before printing, I sent drafts to people I'd worked with, investors, clients, industry leaders, and to women who had asked me how to maintain their personal values in a male-dominated world. Their feedback wasn't just praise. They were moving letters about how they found themselves. In my story, the book was a final attempt to connect with a father who never truly listened. It wasn't just about him, but about what I learned growing up in his shadow: resilience, quiet strength, self-reliance, and even loneliness. I called it a spiritual letter, not to beg for affection, but to say, I still see you as a part of who I am, even though you've never truly seen me as your daughter. I chose to give him the book privately. One afternoon, right before the annual family reunion, I arrived early. My mother was out, only he was home. I handed him a silver gray box, wrapped with a ribbon. He opened it. His fingers flipped through the cover. I thought I saw his eyes soften. I thought, for the first time, he might say something positive. But then he smirked and said, "You printed a book about yourself and expect others to read it." One sentence. A single sentence, like a knife, cut straight into the deepest part of me where hope still resided. That one remark turned all my efforts, the writing, editing, fact-checking, recalling memories, into an act of narcissism. I didn't answer. I just smiled, nodded, and withdrew my hand from the gift box, like one pulls trust away from someone who has thrown it to the ground too many times. In my purse, at that moment, was a thick envelope. Inside were the results of a DNA test. A week prior, while getting my genes checked for health reasons, I discovered anomalies that quietly prompted me to do a paternity test. The result: Stephen Grant, the man I had called Dad for 32 years, was not my biological father. I had opened it, read it over and over, then put it away. I hadn't told anyone. I didn't plan to tell anyone. I just carried it with me, like a truth I didn't yet know what to do with. But then, that evening, at the annual party where all our relatives, business partners, and close friends were present, my father stood up, raised his glass before the entire family, and declared, "I'm proud of all my children, except for the loser." He looked at no one else but me, and I stood up, quietly, without a word. I left the party, but only to return one last time. I grew up in Wellesley, a quiet, affluent suburb west of Boston. To outsiders, my family was the quintessential American archetype: a white two-story house, a meticulously manicured lawn, a father who ran a prestigious real estate company, a mother involved in local charities, and 3 private school-educated children. Everything was perfect, at least, from outside the white picket fence. I was the eldest. My younger brother, Daniel, went to Harvard Business School, then became CEO at Grant Properties with my father. My youngest sister, Emily, studied international relations at Wellesley College. She was a natural communicator, graceful, and always knew the right thing to say at the right time. And me, Natalie, chose the scenic route. I took a full scholarship to Georgetown, majored in financial analysis, and then worked for a fintech startup in Chicago. I didn't choose the family path. And that was something Stephen Grant, man I still called Dad, never forgave. From an early age, I was the only one never praised for doing things right, but heavily criticized for mistakes. When Daniel learned piano, Dad hired a private tutor and bought him a Steinway. When I asked to take art lessons, he said, "Do you think you're going to make a living with watercolors?" I tried. I really did. Always tried. I scored a 1580 on the SAT, in the top 2% nationally. I received scholarships from 5 Ivy League schools but chose Georgetown because I wanted to live far from Boston. That was enough for my father to say in front of all our relatives at Thanksgiving that year, "Natalie just likes to do things backward, always has to be different." I didn't react. because my mother, Margaret, would look at me pleadingly. "Don't make a scene, dear. That's just his way of loving." I believed her. Believed my father loved in his own way. But year after year, only one thing became clearer. He loved the idea of an ideal child, not his flesh and blood children. I remember the only time he took me on an outing alone, just the two of us. I was 10. He agreed to take me to the Science Museum because Mom had an unexpected errand. During the entire trip, he barely said anything beyond reminders. "Don't run. Stand still. Don't ask too many questions." I went home and wrote in my diary that I think Dad started to like me a little more today. Now, looking back, I don't know whether to pity or feel sorry for that child. When I went to college, I had to cover all expenses beyond my scholarship because my father cut my personal allowance, saying, "Those who choose their own path must take care of themselves." I once worked 3 jobs simultaneously: teaching assistant, coffee shop server, and unpaid intern during summer breaks. Yet, every time I came home, I'd bring sandwiches from the airport to give to my mother. I never returned empty-handed to my father, and not to my own self-respect. Once, I almost fainted in the library from too many late nights. A classmate took me to the infirmary. I lied to my mother, saying I just had a mild cold. I didn't want her to worry. Nor did I want him to know. I couldn't bear to be seen as weak, especially by him. I remember one year, my mother had a minor car accident. I was in the middle of a project review period, but flew home immediately. Daniel didn't come. Emily texted, "Let me know if it's serious." I was the one who drove Mom for her checkup, the one who cleaned the kitchen where she had spilled boiling water. When she recovered, my father just said, "I thought you wouldn't come back. I'm surprised you actually have some sense." That wasn't praise, it was as if I'd passed a test he didn't expect me to. When I graduated top of my class in financial analysis, he didn't attend. Mom said, "He's busy with a big client meeting." I later found out he was playing golf with Gregory Hayes' close friend and strategic partner. Daniel Kames just stood from a distance, took a few photos, and left early. Emily sent a text, "Proud of you, sis." That was enough. I worked at 3 different companies before joining ArborVest Capitalware. For the first time, I was evaluated not for my last name, but for my abilities. I began writing investment analyses for major publications, was invited to speak at conferences, and was called a pioneer woman in fintech, but my father never mentioned it. Every time I was nominated for an industry award, I emailed my mother and father, receiving only silence from him, and the sole reply from my mother, "Your father says it's good, but you should still learn to be more reserved." I remained silent because I didn't want to break the fragile balance in the family. I continued to show up at gatherings, though my heart always felt heavy. I brought birthday presents, helped my mother organize Christmas, gave my father cufflinks engraved with all 3 of our initials, but every time I stood beside him, I felt like an invisible object. My mother, though gentle and loving, always chose stability. She feared arguments, conflicts, and outsiders, knowing our business. She once told me, "Sometimes silence is strength." But for me, silence was just a way to disappear. Years later, when I could afford it, I gifted my father a trip to Napa Valley for 2, just him and my mother. He didn't go. He replied through my mother, "Uncomfortable letting others pay for me, especially family." I understood the message. No matter how successful I became, to him, I was always the outsider child. I didn't talk about the sleepless nights due to stress, or the time I was cut from a project because they prioritized a partner's son. I didn't talk about crying in the company restroom after being called a cold machine, when I was just trying not to let anyone see my weakness. All of that, I packed away, and wrote into a book. The memoir was a final attempt. Not for forgiveness, but to prove I had learned something from him, and I still wanted to believe I belonged to this family. I thought that if he saw the journey I'd been through, he would open his heart, or at least, I could close that chapter of my childhood with peace. I didn't know, as I wrote those lines, that my DNA would tell a different story. And then, all the truth would be exposed under the chandeliers, amidst the clinking of glasses, and under the proud gaze of a man who had never looked at me with an acknowledging eye. That year's reunion took place at our family's Cape Cod villa, where we usually hosted big events like Thanksgiving or my grandparents' wedding anniversary. Everyone was there, aunts, uncles, cousins, from afar, and even a few of Dad's close business partners. Mom was busy with flower arrangements and menu choices, while Emily handled the music and celebratory speeches. I arrived early, as usual, to help set up. But this time I came with a different mindset. I carried the truth. The DNA test results envelope was in my purse, not to start a fight, but to protect myself. I had opened it a week before, when everything became clear. I was not Stephen Grant's biological daughter. What was even more shocking, he had known it all along. My mother was pregnant with me when she met him. They married just a few months later. And on my birth certificate, he still agreed to be listed as the legal father. But that didn't make him act like a real father. He accepted me into the house as a formality and kept me on the fringes of recognition for 32 years. I don't know why he agreed to be my father. But he never once made me feel loved the way Daniel and Emily were. Perhaps he thought it was noble enough that I should be grateful for life. But emotions don't follow reason. Children don't need to be adopted to know if they are loved. They feel it from a glance, from silence, from every time they're overlooked. I didn't intend to tell anyone the truth at the reunion. I still wore the navy blue dress my mother loved. Still helped Aunt Susan prepare her signature lasagna. Still hugged everyone as if I wasn't carrying a secret that could shake the entire Grant lineage until Stephen Grant, the most powerful man in the room, my nominal father, stepped up to the podium amidst clinking glasses and soft jazz music. He smiled. It was the smile I had once longed to see directed at me, but this time it was for Daniel. It's wonderful to have all three of my children here today. Daniel, running the company like a true successor. Emily, always keeping her gentle and intelligent spirit. And Natalie. He paused. I heard the whole room hold its breath. Always a special individual. In her own way, a few polite laughs, not from me. I knew how he used the word special. It wasn't a compliment. It was a semantic shrug, a sign he had tried but was helpless. But anyway, he raised his glass higher, his eyes on the crowd, his voice resonating as if rehearsed. I'm proud of all my children. Except for one loser. There were scattered laughs. The sound of glasses accidentally clinking. Quiet gasps, but all I heard was my heart pounding like an alarm bell. I stood up, very slowly. No one stopped me. No one called me back. I walked out of the room like someone draining oxygen from a greenhouse. I went out to the backyard. It was twilight. The lanterns hanging on the magnolia trees began to glow. I stood there, still holding my purse. Emily was the first to follow me out. She said, "He didn't mean it. You know that. He just isn't good at expressing himself." I turned to look at my sister, her face still sweet and agreeable, and asked, "Have you ever heard him call Daniel a loser?" She was silent. After a moment, she turned and went back inside. I didn't cry, not yet. I just pulled out the envelope, placed it on the wooden table outside, opened it again, looked at the undeniable percentages. I thought of every time he said, "You're not part of this family." Every time he said, "Don't think your success means anything in this house." And I understood. He wasn't my father. But the most painful thing wasn't the biological truth. It was that for 32 years, I had asked for affection from someone who never intended to give it to me. I returned to the living room. Everyone was still eating dessert. No one asked where I had been. Stephen was still at the head table, between Daniel and Gregory Hayes, chatting animatedly. I approached, placed the envelope on the table in front of him. He looked at me, momentarily surprised. "What's this?" "Proof of your statement," I said. "Because you were right, I'm not a Grant." He looked at the envelope, then at me. "What do you think you just did?" "Not just did," I said, "but for the past 32 years. I turned away, leaving him with all eyes in the room now, turning toward him. Only this time, he was the one who had to explain. And I, for the first time, didn't feel the need to stay and listen. I didn't go straight to my car. I walked along the cobblestone path leading to the beach behind the house. The salty ocean wind swept through my hair, bringing a feeling both cold and light. I didn't know what I would say to my mother, to Daniel, to Emily, but one thing I knew for sure, I would no longer be silent. I sat down on the wooden bench my grandfather had built from local oak, where my mother and I used to watch fireworks every 4th of July. Suddenly, the past flooded back. The times I intentionally told jokes to make my father laugh. The times I volunteered to clean up just hoping he'd say a word of recognition. The times I won awards but hid them because I knew he'd call it luck. I realized I had lived my whole life like someone begging for a ticket to my own family's movie theater, and now, I had torn that ticket. My phone vibrated. A text from Jasmine, my best friend from college. "Everything okay? Your mom just called me." I texted back one line. For the first time, I can breathe. When I returned to the parking lot, it was completely dark. I didn't go back into the house. I started the car and left Cape Cod, leaving behind, not just a party, but an entire role I had played for too long. The next day, I received an email from Emily. Subject: I'm sorry. The content was brief. I didn't know things were that bad. I've never seen him treat me that way. I think I need to reevaluate everything. I didn't reply immediately. I needed time. Not to forgive, but to rearrange who truly deserved to be in my life after this moment. I also received a missed call from my mother. No voicemail. I guessed she didn't know what to say, or perhaps was struggling between defending him and siding with me. That no longer mattered as much. I reprinted my memoir, this time adding a new chapter. Title: The Legacy I Choose to End. 3 days later, my mother arrived in Chicago. Unannounced. I opened the door and saw her standing there with a small suitcase, her face exhausted and worried. We sat on the living room sofa. No tea, no cookies, no rituals, just two women who had once protected each other, now facing an undeniable truth. Can you tell me why you gave him that envelope? She asked. Because he needed to see what he already knew, but never dared to face, I said directly. She looked down at her hands. I couldn't tell if it was disappointment, grief, or fear, but the only thing I didn't see was surprise. You knew, I said. She was silent, then nodded very slowly. He didn't want me to tell you. He thought, if he raised you well enough, you wouldn't need to know. But he didn't raise me well enough. For the first time in my life, I saw my mother cry without covering her face. She let the tears flow like a woman tired of keeping silent for too long. I'm sorry, she said. I thought if I kept the peace, everything would be okay. But you paid a higher price than anyone. I didn't console her. I wasn't angry. I just remained silent, and this time, silence was the answer. That afternoon, I told her I wouldn't be coming home for holidays anymore. No birthdays, no Christmases, not again. I didn't want to live another moment where my self-worth was defined by someone who didn't see me as their child. My mother asked, "What about me?" I replied, "If you want to see me, you can come here like today. But I won't go to a place where I was called a loser anymore." 3 days after my mother left, I received an email from Daniel. Long, polished, full of cautious language. He wrote about everyone being in disarray. That dad is deeply hurt. That the family is fractured and needs a leader. I replied with 3 sentences. I'm not a leader. I used to be a burden bearer. Now I'm just someone living by my own values. Daniel didn't reply again. And my father. He didn't text, didn't call, but a week later, I received a letter from his law office requesting that I not use the name Grant in public publications, including my memoir. I laughed. Not angry, not shocked, just laughed. I had already signed a new publishing contract with a major publisher, and I changed the author's name on the cover. From Natalie Grant to Natalie M. M is the first letter of my mother's name, a way to acknowledge the only person who, despite her mistakes, still had a part of true affection. They didn't know I had changed. They still thought I was the silent Natalie, the sacrificing Natalie, the returning Natalie, but she no longer existed. Now, I was the one setting boundaries. I was the one who knew when to retreat and not look back. I started with the smallest things, unfollowing the family group chat. I no longer responded with read every time Emily messaged about booking Thanksgiving flights, or photos of Daniel cutting the ribbon on a new building. I remained silent, not out of anger, but because silence was now an active choice. Jasmine, my college best friend, invited me to her home in Portland for the holidays. No pressure, just us, wine, and scented candles, she said. I nodded. For the first time in years, I didn't feel guilty about not being at the Grant family dinner table. My mother called on Christmas morning. I didn't answer. She left a long voicemail, apologizing and reminding me there was an empty seat beside her if I changed my mind. I deleted the message without listening to the end. Not because I hated her, but because I understood. Forgiveness also takes time, and boundaries aren't flexible to someone else's schedule. I started therapy more regularly. In my 3rd session, I told my psychologist, I don't think I want to be accepted anymore. I just want to be free. She smiled, and for the first time, I felt I was articulating the lifelong pain. Daniel sent a short text after New Year's. If you want to clear things up, I'm willing to fly to Chicago. I texted back, you should ask if I want to clear things up. Then, I blocked him. I was too tired of always being the one to manage everyone's emotions for the family. I rearranged my apartment. Put away everything related to them: greeting cards, family photos, even memories I once considered reasons to try. I didn't destroy them, just put them away like one stores a part of memory that has passed its expiration date. One afternoon, I walked past a picture framing shop. I went in and framed a photo I took with a group of women at an investment conference last year where I was the keynote speaker. That photo now sits in the middle of my living room, under natural light, like a silent declaration. This is my family, the people who chose to listen to me, learn from me, and never asked me to be anyone but myself. The silence from the Grant family continued, and I let it. Because sometimes, no reaction is also a form of answer. And the strongest boundary isn't an open rejection, but the courage to reclaim your own space without needing anyone's permission. About 2 months after the holidays, I received a call from an unexpected person, Gregory Hay, Grant's closest associate, and someone who had witnessed that chaotic reunion party. He wanted to invite me to participate in a strategic investment advisory project, part of an initiative aimed at female founders in finance. We need a voice that truly understands what it feels like to be marginalized, he said. I was silent for a few seconds, then agreed. A few weeks later, the press release was issued. Natalie M became the program director for the Reclaim Fund, with a budget of over $50 million, designed to support female entrepreneurs who had faced invisible barriers from the old power system. Of course, the media delved into my past, especially once they knew I was Stephen Grant's on-paper daughter. Some articles questioned whether the family rift was the motivation for my feminist finance career. I didn't deny it. In a podcast interview, I said, "I'm not seeking revenge on anyone. I'm simply retracting access to the energy and sacrifice I once gave to people who didn't know how to appreciate it." The reaction was widespread. Hundreds of emails poured in from women across America, women whose fathers had belittled them, whose husbands had undermined them, whose bosses had sidelined them for not fitting the standard successor mold. They told me their stories, and I, for the first time, felt I wasn't alone in the fight to reclaim my worth. A month later, I released the second edition of my memoir, this time with a new title, Not the Exception, A Legacy of Boundaries. The book sold out in the first 36 hours. I received an invitation to speak at a conference in New York. My topic: No one has the right to define your family loyalty by your acceptance of pain. In the auditorium that day, I saw people crying, not from sorrow, but because they saw themselves in my story. Stephen didn't publicly respond, but I heard he called Gregory to express disappointment for involving Natalie in the project. Gregory replied, "I didn't involve her. I kept up with her." Daniel sent a text, "For the first time in months. I understand why you did it. I still don't know whose side to be on, but at least I know you're not the Natalie of old anymore." I didn't reply. I didn't need validation. I had reclaimed my position not in anyone else's heart, but within my own coordinates. The greatest revenge, sometimes, is simply becoming the version they never believed you could be, and then living your life without explanation. I started receiving invitations to join nonprofit boards. One organization invited me to be a media ambassador for equality in financial literacy. I accepted and built a campaign called Finance Doesn't Have a Father, aiming to convey that success doesn't need a patriarchal endorsement. The campaign spread widely. Over 20,000 women signed up for free training programs. Many shared that this was the first time they felt heard without being dismissed due to their background or origin. I read every line of feedback and felt every step was worth it. A week later, my mother called again. Her voice was no longer pleading. This time, it was calmer and somewhat hesitant. She said, "I saw you on TV. You've become something beyond anything I ever imagined." I didn't rush to answer. I just asked, "Are you proud?" She hesitated, then said softly, "I feel relieved, because you don't need him to be yourself." I didn't cry, but after the call, I sat silently. For a long time, in that quietness, I felt what I had always sought: not praise, but witness. I met Emily again at a workshop. She no longer lived at home, having moved to work for a nonprofit organization in San Diego. She hugged me for a long time and said, "You gave me the courage to live authentically." I smiled. We had dinner that night without mentioning our father. Daniel remained silent. I heard my father's company was struggling. Some partners withdrew due to value conflicts. But I didn't intervene. I didn't gloat. I just observed as an outsider. I was no longer Natalie the bird. I was Natalie, the one writing her own next chapter, and the greatest irony was, only when they lost me did they begin to truly see me. I also received an invitation from a community college where I used to teach evening classes years ago, inviting me back as an honored speaker for this year's graduation. I accepted. Standing on stage, I saw hundreds of students, mostly adults, returning to school to change their lives. And I remembered the years I felt invisible in my own family. I opened my speech with a sentence. You don't need anyone's validation to be worthy. Your value isn't in your bloodline, but in your choice to rise after every rejection. The applause that followed wasn't for MIT, was for every person in that room, who had once felt small in a house that didn't see them. Around the same time, my father Steven had to testify before the company's board. After a series of criticisms about his statements and non-transparent and patriarchal management style, some former employees, including those I had once recommended, sent open letters, sharing their experiences of being marginalized for being women or not being part of the system. The press began questioning the internal culture at Grant Properties. In an anonymous interview, a source from within said, Natalie herself warned about these issues many years ago, but no one listened then. I made no comment. I was busy running the new investment fund for founders of color in the Midwest, and that was the part of my legacy I wanted to leave. I also reconnected with an old flame of in whom I had dated while working in fintech. We had broken up because I couldn't commit to anything while I was still trying so hard to be accepted at home, but this time, I was different. He was still the same warm, calm, and ready to listen. I don't know where we're headed, but at least, I no longer love from a place of begging for acceptance, and for me, that was already a victory. The following spring, news spread. Steven Grant officially resigned from his CEO position at Grant Properties after continuous pressure from shareholders and the media. The press release stated briefly, Mr. Steven Grant decided to retire early to focus on his health and family, but those inside the company knew it wasn't a voluntary retirement, but the result of a series of trust crises. A business magazine published an in-depth analysis of his image collapse. Once considered a model of a conservative but effective founder, now Steven Grant serves as a prime example of a leader who failed to adapt to the new era where human values and inclusion are no longer optional. Daniel, his successor, took over during a period of immense pressure, but he no longer received the unconditional respect he once did, partly because his father's ghost still lingered in internal policies, and partly because Natalie's voice had now spread even to the investment world. My mother called me one May evening. She said, "Everything is falling apart. Natalie, you may not need to come back, but I hope you know that everything you're doing is making others reconsider." I replied, "I don't want them to reconsider because of me. I want them to reconsider because of themselves." A week later, I received an email from a former employee of Grant Properties, a black woman, who had been excluded from a management nomination list for being not suitable enough for the company culture. She wrote, "I read your book. I left the company last year. Now I'm starting my own. I don't think I would have had the courage if it weren't for you daring to walk away." I sat for a long time after that email. Not to cry, but to remember that when you choose to break the silence, you don't just save yourself, you open the door for others to step out with you. Emily sent me a photo of her standing next to a large banner that read, "We set boundaries, not walls." She was at a conference about justice in education. She texted, "You didn't just save yourself. You showed me what it's like to find freedom without apologizing." As for Evan, we gradually started sharing our lives again. No rush, no drama. We cooked together, went for weekend walks, and learned to trust in the present. Not as something we had to rescue, but as a well-deserved reward. I no longer waited for the day Steven would apologize. I didn't need a letter, a call, or a belated hug, because the truth is, sometimes, another person's awakening isn't a gift, the reward for your own steadfast choice. And what I learned most clearly from all of this is, you can't control how others treat you, but you can choose not to stay where hurt is the unspoken standard. I chose to walk away. And the miracle is, when I left that old place, I didn't lose my family. I only lost my loneliness. One night, while preparing a speech for a conference in Washington, D.C., I received a text from an old number. It was the cousin who had sided with my father at that reunion. The text simply read, "I was wrong. Hope to hear your side of the story someday." I didn't reply, but I screenshotted it, saving it in a folder I named Proof. I didn't imagine what I went through. I also started writing a new series on my personal blog, sharing topics about redefining personal worth after family trauma. Those articles spread unexpectedly over 100,000 shares in just 1 month. I realized, the truth always finds someone to reach, if you're brave enough to tell it. A publisher in England invited me to release an international version. In the invitation letter, the editor wrote, "We don't see this as a memoir, we see this as a manifesto." I cried. This time, it was from relief. Emily sent me a handwritten drawing, an abstract image of 3 women walking through a door not holding hands, but heading in the same direction. She wrote, "Omi and Mom. Each free in our own way." I framed the picture and hung it in my office. And Daniel, I know he's trying to restructure the company, struggling with questions he never had to face when everything was in his father's hands. I don't gloat, I just hope he truly understands. Not every legacy is worth preserving. I posted a photo on Instagram, standing in front of a conference sign with the caption, "Family is important, but so are you." That photo went viral because of me, but because the message resonated with people struggling to be seen as whole individuals. I had lived a lifetime to be acknowledged by someone who never intended to do it. And finally, I don't need it anymore. I wrote one final line in my journal. When you stop asking for permission to exist, that's when you truly begin to live. A year after the reunion party, I hosted a book signing at a small coffee shop in Seattle. I didn't expect a huge crowd, but over 300 people lined up. They weren't there for an author. They were there for a story that mirrored their own. A middle-aged woman hugged me for a long time. She whispered, "Thank you. Because I just refused to attend my daughter's wedding after 30 years of being seen as an unconditional burden bearer. I don't want to start a new chapter in an old role," I told her. "You're not selfish when you set boundaries. You're teaching others how to stay in your life." I repeated that every time I was invited to share. Every workshop, every podcast, every email I replied to. Because the truth is, many people grow up in families where they have to earn the right to emotionally exist. The memoir has now been translated into 9 languages. A university in the Netherlands included it in their sociology curriculum. I received a video from a classroom. 40 students stood up and applauded when the professor mentioned my name. I don't see that as fame. I see it as affirmation. My story is not alone. I still write, still work, still love in a gentler and more mature way. And I learned that forgiveness doesn't mean allowing them back. Forgiveness is sometimes how you unchain yourself. I did see my father again at an uncle's funeral. He arrived late, sat at the back of the room, looking at no one. When I stood up to speak, his eyes briefly met mine. I didn't look away. I didn't need him to bow his head. Just for him to see me standing strong, speaking clearly, and no longer afraid. Afterward, he left before the ceremony ended. Words, no reaction. And for me, that was also a form of closure. When I shared that on my blog, a reader commented, "Your story helped me leave a relationship I always thought was family." I replied, "Family is where you can be yourself, no strings attached." If you're reading this, perhaps you too were made to believe you weren't enough, not good enough, not smart enough, not enough like what they wanted. I want you to know, you are not alone, and you deserve a life where your worth doesn't need daily proof. You can start with a small boundary. One time saying no. One time being silent. One time not replying to a text because you need space. That's not selfish. That's beginning to live as yourself. Family is important, but so are you. I look back at my journey, from a child always trying to be chosen, to a woman who chooses herself every day. I no longer count the times I was made to feel inadequate. I count the times I got back up. I know, many of you reading this are also standing at some kind of threshold. The threshold of choosing yourself, choosing truth, choosing to leave or to stay in a new way. I don't have all the answers, but I know one thing. No one should have to apologize for protecting themselves. So, if you're on that journey, give yourself patience. Allow yourself to be soft without feeling weak. Allow yourself to be angry, to be sad, to dream of a family where you don't have to sacrifice to belong. And if someone ever told you that you weren't enough, remember that they were measuring you by the limits of their own perspective. You don't need to win in their eyes. You just need to stop losing in your own. If Natalie M's journey resonated with you, please hit like, subscribe, and send this video to someone you think needs to hear it. Because sometimes, losing what we once believed was family is Exactly how we find ourselves, again whole and no longer needing permission to exist.